Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Navigate. This is the place where we talk about all things transition related and beyond. And my goal is to encourage and resource you as you as you journey through, and as you emerge on the other side of transition. And to you regular listeners out there, I just want to say thanks. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for listening. I hope you've had some good takeaways. That's my goal, and I would love to hear how this podcast has helped you in any way, shape, or form. So please give me a review, give us some feedback, and I really think you're going to enjoy this conversation today. Transitions are pivotal points in our personal histories. And today we're going to be hearing from pastor and author Dick Foth as he talks about friendship, storytelling, and big transitions. Dick is married to Ruth, and together they have 4 married children, 12 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. Since 1966, Dick has worked in various roles as a pastor, teacher, and sought-after speaker for conferences, retreats, civic groups, and universities. He actually was president of Bethany College when I attended there in Scotts Valley, California. He was president there from 1978 to 1992. From 1993 to 2008, Dick was a team member with National Prayer Breakfast and a life coach in Washington, D.C. And since 2008, Dick and Ruth have lived in northern Colorado, where he serves on the teaching team of Timberline Church and where they continue to work with community, business, and church leaders. He's often described as a collector of people, a connector, and a storyteller. His most recent book is called Known: Finding Deep Friendships in a Shallow World, and it's co-authored with his wife, Ruth. So, let's dive into a conversation I had with Dick Foth last month at Timberline Church in Fort Collins, Colorado. All right. Well, welcome to this episode of Navigate, Dick, and I'm so glad you could join me.
My joy.
And we go back a ways from Bethany College days, Bethany University days, whatever we called it back then.
Whatever it was.
We had some name changes there. Yeah. I think I graduated in 91 from Bethany, and my wife, Eve, graduated in 92. And that was your last year.
And as soon as you were done, I left.
As soon as I was done.
Left in June of 92.
It was all you could take, right?
That's it.
Well, it's such a privilege to have you being on our show. And our listeners out there are going to be encouraged, challenged, and blessed, I'm sure, today through this conversation. And we're just going to open it up. Pretty broad right now, and we've talked a little bit about what this podcast is about in broad strokes in terms of transition and dealing with transition and living out life in transition seasons. So what's something you have learned while navigating a challenging transition? Maybe what's one thing that stands out to you?
Yeah, I think that to understand that all transition pretty much is risk and reward. From the very first one, from the womb to the world of the giants, that's the most frightening transition you have. One of the reasons that I like reading Jesus is that he did that too. One of my favorite things was a youth publication years ago called Youth Alive that had a double page centerfold. This would be back in the 70s, and it was a nude. It was a naked baby just born, umbilical cord still attached, and bold block letters on the bottom of the page that said, "Emmanuel, God with us." You talk about transition from heaven to earth, from glory to guts, if you will. I think the risk reward piece of any transition that I've ever been a part of really stands out.
Okay.
And you never know what those percentages are.
Yeah.
How high the risk, how high the reward, whatever.
Right. Right. So has a transition in terms of risk reward ever not worked in your favor?
Over time, they have all worked in my favor.
Yeah.
Some are scarier at the front end. When Eve graduated from Bethany, I spoke at the baccalaureate that year. I just took the privilege of sort of presidential privilege, and I read from Hebrews 11 where it says that Abram obeyed God and went to a place he didn't know. And I just said, one of the greatest faith statements is, I don't know. People say, where are you going? I don't know. Now, I know with whom I'm going, but I don't know where I'm going. And, of course, that's the big piece, right? Right. With whom you travel is the big deal. And when I said, I'm leaving Bethany, and I don't know what's going to happen next, like the whole senior class went, yes, because they didn't know either. So all of a sudden we're buddies,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think that transition, at my age, I was 50. Transitioning at 50 is very different than loading up a car when you're 23, like we did, and left California, went to do a church plant at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana when I'm 23. Quarter of a century in terms of how you approach transition, right, or how you feel it, is very different. Yeah. So I think probably that was the scariest, in the sense of not fear, but anxiousness about not knowing what was on the other end. Yeah. But simply because we were going to a place where there was no salary, there was no staff, there was no budget, there was,
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
but that all got figured out.
All got figured out.
Fast forward from 92, when you gave that message about Abraham. Right. So it was 95, and Eve and I were getting ready to go to launch out into Central Asia, Tajikistan. Right. And the Lord gave me that scripture where God said to Abraham, "Go to the land I will show you." Yeah. So he hadn't shown us yet, and he wasn't planning to. Yeah. But stepping out, risk and reward.
Yeah, I think that's I think moving when you can't see the end from the beginning. It's one thing to move to a place where there's a job or there's resources, because resources is always the key piece, right? Right. Even that has its challenges, but going where you're not sure what's there, that's a pretty different deal.
That's different. Yeah. So for you, having navigated a few transitions in your life, what characterizes a successful or healthy transition?
I think the other day I was listening to a podcast, and it was a vice president of a well-known company, and he made the comment that in any group he goes into, he now asks a different question than he did 20 years ago. It wasn't, how can I run this meeting, or what are they going to learn from me? The question that he chooses to ask now is, by my presence in the room, will there be value added? I think one of the qualifiers, or one of the marks of an effective transition, is when you land, when you get your feet on the ground, to what degree is there value added? And because that cuts both ways. Is it value added to me? Like all the things you learned when you landed in Central Asia about life and people and culture and religious systems that you thought you knew about them, you'd read about them, but you didn't know them. Right. And so your experience there for a decade and a half or more changes who you are, and clearly is value added to your life. Whereas oftentimes we make transitions, especially in charitable work or the kinds of work, where we feel like we're the people bringing the value, and a lot of times we get surprised. Yeah. When I was in Washington, D.C., Ruth and I were in D.C. from 93 to 2008, 15 years. And the city's divided into quadrants. And Southeast D.C. is the least served, the most underserved quadrant of D.C. across the Anacostia River. People would say, well, those are poor people, or many are on welfare, and all of that. My experience is that I may have learned more in Southeast D.C. about life and resiliency than I did on Capitol Hill. And you could see Capitol Hill from Southeast D.C. So, people surprise us, don't they?
They do. Yeah. So do you think we get it wrong sometimes when we're evaluating a transition and simply kind of say, well, that was a failed transition because I didn't produce or I didn't succeed in some way, as opposed to looking from like what you're saying, I was enriched by this experience. God taught me these things. I learned from other people.
Yeah. Maybe. No, I think that's, transition means movement. It means I'm going from one level to another. It's a sila, isn't it? I think sila, to the degree that they understand what that is take a deep breath or change keys or go to the next step up on the temple stairs. I think the idea of movement, we tend to think of movement forward or upward as transition. As you age, and you'll know this later, you don't know it yet, but as you age, what you find is that you have transitions forced on you by virtue of loss of capacity in some way. Either physically you can't do what you used to do, right, or your eyesight goes, or your hearing is not as good. All those are transitions, and those kind of transitions sometimes are harder to adapt to because you didn't choose it.
Right.
Than some others.
Yeah. And a lot of our listeners out there, I have to guess, are facing forced or rug pulled out transitions, where, maybe they're in a country that the government won't renew their visa, or civil war has erupted, or some kind of health issue is forcing them to shift gears and change or to move. And so there's a lot about these forced transitions which can just totally rock our world and change things up for us. And so in the work we do with cross-cultural workers,
right,
we talk a lot about self-care or soul care, but really this has application to whatever vocation you choose and you're involved with. So, and again, going back, kind of along those lines of soul care, how have you practiced self-care or soul care, and does it look different? Has it looked different for you while in transition as opposed to seasons of relative calm and stability?
I've had a belief and a practice for a long time that I didn't always have, and that is I was brought up in a religious environment where your primary communication in terms of spiritual matters or even emotional psychological matters was vertical. It's with the God I couldn't see. I was introduced to what was called back in the 70s relational theology through guys like Lloyd Ogilvie and Cecil Osborne and guys who aren't known now as much. And it's that other piece. It's love God with your whole heart. And the other thing is like unto it, as the old King James would say. Love your neighbor as yourself. This idea of what happens when you walk with a handful of people intimately over time. How does that help care for your soul? I have a friend who says, if when you are young, you will choose 2 or 3 people older than you, by whom you will run major decisions or through whom, if you will do that and stay with those 2 or 3 folks, your decisions almost happen on the backstroke. Good decisions.
Okay.
So in terms of soul or self-care, whenever we've made a move, there have been a handful of people in our life with whom we have discussed, stayed in contact. I wouldn't say we've made contracts, but I think there's the idea of covenant that plays into that. That you find in Matthew 18, even though Jesus is talking about how you deal with struggles in the congregation, this idea of where two or three are gathered in my name, I show up if you agree on anything. And what we tend to do with that passage is we say, well, there's a prayer need. Why don't we hold hands here, these three of us, and we'll do that. I'm not sure at all that's what that's talking about. I do think it is this idea that I am committed to you as a brother or a sister or as a friend in covenant. Covenant is a word that's lost from our language, except when you buy a piece of property these days. Unless you join the military. And then you take a covenant, an oath, a pledge, a promise to defend the Constitution of the United States, in our case, against all enemies, foreign, domestic, so forth. That idea of are there people other than, say, a spouse to whom I have a pledge that I want them to be in my life going forward? I speak with lots of young people. They're sort of my favorite people group from 18 to 30. And this idea of how do I find deep relationships or covenant relationships is something that's almost a foreign language today. Okay. But your question was about soul or self-care. And I think for us, for Ruth and me, having a cadre of folks, doesn't have to be a big group, excuse me, who are praying for us. We're talking by phone, writing letters. That piece has helped enormously.
Great. Well, yeah, and that, so in speaking about soul care and self-care, you bring in this whole dimension of the horizontal, and oftentimes we only think in terms of the vertical, like you said. Right. So this may be a good time to bring in some things you talk about in your most recent book that you authored with your wife Ruth.
Right.
Can you just tell me more about
Sure.
In terms of, because you're talking about connectedness, right. You're talking about relationship here, and I'm guessing that maybe there's some content in that book around that theme.
Well, the book's called Known: Finding Deep Friendships in a Shallow World. And it's tilted toward younger people. There's an MIT psychologist by the name of Dr. Sherry Turkle who studied this for 20 years. And she says the internet defines itself or imagines itself as the architect of our intimacies. And this came home to me when I asked two or three university students a few years ago, sitting over breakfast, give me a word that defines your generation or your age group. And this one young junior in university said, overwhelmed. And when he said that, I said, seriously? I said, I think my parents' generation was overwhelmed. They had the First World War, the Great Depression, Second World War. What are you overwhelmed by? He said, information. I said, well, I get that. There's been more new information generated in the last 2 years than in the history of mankind. And it'll happen again in the next 2 years. So that is overwhelming. We're getting it through all of our devices. I said, yeah, but you're so connected. He said, well, I'm on Facebook and Snapchat and all that. But he said, my problem is I don't know how to start a conversation. So every relationship starts with a conversation. Mm-hmm. And we live in a culture where the family dinner table is rapidly disappearing. The places where we have conversations, whether it's family or school or religious group, also have less tactile or tensile strength in our lives. They used to sort of frame who we are. Not so, not now. And so the key in terms of relationship is how do I get there? Yeah. How do I start that? And I'll just give you 4 bases real quickly.
Yeah.
I call this relational baseball. It's not mine. It's borrowed from a fellow named Lyman Coleman, who was a small group guru back in the 70s. I always say that originality is the art of concealing your sources. But I just gave you who mine was. But I was introduced to the idea of this lateral or horizontal piece of faith and practice back at a retreat, a conference that was held in Italy, Sorrento, Italy in 1972. And I was 30 years old. It was Ruth's my first trip overseas. And he introduced us to these 4 ideas for building relationship. First, if you think in terms of baseball, and not everybody may think in those terms, it might be soccer or football, as you call it. But first base would be story or history giving. So for an example, if I were to say to you, Tim Austin, where's home for you originally? What would you tell me?
Chico, California.
Where did your people come from? Your grandparents or your parents?
Yeah, Sweden.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Sweden. Do you know when?
Not really.
Okay. So what did you do in Chico for fun as a kid? I mean, Chico State was a party school, so I'm not talking about that. Yeah. I'm talking about prior to, like when you were
growing up.
Yeah, elementary school. What'd you do for fun?
Fishing, hunting. Yeah, I love the outdoors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you do that in Tajikistan?
I tried my hardest, but it wasn't easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was challenging because in Tajikistan the rules have all changed as far as how
what
you
can
get
do.
permits to do these kinds of things, and so. But I tried.
So, where was the coolest place in your town to go when you were a teenager?
Coolest place to go. I think my mind would go back to Bear Hole. It was a big, deep hole that was in the foothills just outside of our town. A stream that fed this big swimming hole, and we'd all gather there and jump off the cliffs and could spend all day there.
See, now people say, well, what does all that have to do with relationship? Well, it has nothing to do with it unless I want to really know what shaped you. So if I say to you, who in your growing up years left their fingerprints on your soul in a significant positive way, who would you say?
I would say I spent a lot of time with my aunt, my father's sister, and I just actually officiated at her funeral a couple years ago.
What was her name?
Her name was Claudette.
Claudette.
Yeah, and she took basically when I was the 4th child.
Yeah.
And after number 3, my parents were, I think, pretty tired. My mom especially was pretty tired. So she was happy for Claudette, my aunt, to take me, and she loved kids, and so I spent a good half of my growing up years probably with Claudette.
I mean, who would think of a person who sort of took on a country like Tajikistan would say that one of the shaping influences in his life was an aunt named Claudette in Chico, California. I just find that fascinating.
Yeah.
And I was in a room with 4 leaders in government that if I were to say a couple of their names, people who were older would know them instantly from previous administrations in the United States. And I asked them, who left their fingerprints on your soul when you were a kid? And 4 of the 5 said my grandmother. So when I start hearing your story, like I'm again, and I won't take us off track too far here, but I was born in Alameda, California, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 1942. I was working with some leaders in Japan some years ago, 50 leaders from the Japanese Diet, from people who were industrialists, and we decided to do small groups. Well, in that part of the world, the idea of small groups, with the saving of face, the hierarchy, I mean, that's a very difficult. But I had not a young Japanese friend, older than I am. I said, Koji, come do this with me. And so I said, Koji, where were you born and brought up? He said, I was born in Tokyo, Dick. Brought up in Tokyo my whole life. And where were you born, Dick? He said, I was born in Alameda, California. We had these 8 groups of 6 around this room, a five-star hotel in Hokkaido. And a Japanese man in perfect English from across the room said, Alameda, that's near Oakland, isn't it? And I said, yes, how did you know that? He said, that's where IBM trained me. When we were done with our session, he made a beeline for me, walked straight up to me, and I was speaking to the president of IBM Japan. And we were buddies because he knew where Alameda was, right? Yeah. The smallest thing you'd say about your story is like a Velcro ribbon to which other people can attach. And there's just all kinds of things like that in story. People say, I don't want to tell my story because it got scars. Well, if you're looking for unscarred people, you're on the wrong planet, right? Yeah. And anyway, that idea is first base. Second base is, as I get to know your story, I learn to know where to love you. And one of the ways we love is by affirmation. So I can affirm you by talking to God about you. We call that prayer. Words to you about that, we call it compliments. Taking an action toward you, or taking an action toward your world, and getting involved in your work. All of those are affirming things. Yeah. And I don't need, in a relationship, I don't need you essentially to tell me what I'm not. I know what I'm not. I desperately need somebody to tell me who I am. And so that your story, first of all, your story never stops. So your story keeps growing even as we're friends, right? Right. So third base then becomes covenant. As we start doing things together, small covenants, let's have a coffee, or let's take a trip, or let's go to a ball game, whatever. Those things express the first 2 bases. Okay. And covenant over time is based on time, tenacity, I'm going to stay with you, and truth-telling. I'll tell you the truth about what I think, feel, and know. And again, I'm just saying a bunch of the stuff that's it. But then home plate is dreaming. If I can trust you with my past, and I can trust you with my now, perhaps I can trust you with some of my crazy dreams. And those are called transitions. Ah, okay. And I just made that up right now. Perfect. But dreaming of something I want to do. Yeah. When I don't know exactly how that's going to happen, how crazy it might be, you don't know. Okay. Nothing happens of consequence without somebody dreaming it. That's just true. Right. Whether it's the light bulb or a new chair or whatever. Right. Okay. So. Yeah. Okay. So that's the connectedness piece. That's the relationship piece. Right. And I'm assuming if people want to read more about that, they can go to your book, Known, and you also have a podcast as well. Yeah, I think if they just Google dickfoth.com, it'll take you to a website called known.fm, and the book's there, and other podcast stuff and messages and so forth. Great. Okay. But I think the thing that was challenging for me to learn was that if I got to know Tim Austin, I could learn about God. If I got to know him, I could see the face of God better. If I loved him, I was actually like loving God. It's like when God has to feel this way because we're made in his image, that when we love his kids, we're actually loving him. Yeah. And his kids put a face on him, if you will. Yeah. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yes, it does. And I think it's like you said, it's challenging because we often don't think of, my mind doesn't necessarily go that direction. As I get to know Dick, I get to know God. Yeah. It goes the other direction. Yeah. We think less of that as spiritual growth. Right. And more as social services. Right. Or compassion ministry or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you were at home base there, and talking about dreaming and transitions, someone you can talk to about some crazy dreams you've had in your life. Yeah. What's one or two people that have stood out to you, or a relationship that has been? My father-in-law, Roy Blakely, Ruth's dad, my wife's dad, came into my life when my father, after 29 years of marriage, was walking. So he left my mom after 29 years of marriage. And Roy, her dad, came into my life, and he was accepting. When I asked for her hand in marriage, I met him. He drove an old pickup truck to a schoolyard in Modesto, California, and I climbed up and said, "I really love your daughter." He said, "We kind of like her too." I said, "I'd like to marry her." He said, "I think that could be arranged." I said, "But I'm scared because, my parents' deal is coming apart, and I think it may be genetic, hereditary." And he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Dick, here's the deal. Look, why don't you love Jesus and love Ruthie? You walk together, and Opal and I, his wife, will walk with you, and it'll be okay. I trust you." And that was 57 years ago. So far, so good.
So far, so good.
So there's he was always a dreamer. He wasn't a high-profile person. He wasn't on the front page of a magazine. He just did stuff that other people. He started taking high schoolers and college students to Mexico when nobody was doing that back in the late 50s and early 60s.
Right.
He started a Christian school when nobody was doing that in his arena. He built a senior citizens center with government money, HUD money, when nobody was doing that. And he just did it. And so when we decided to go to Washington, D.C., and I was 50, and I didn't know where the income was going to come from, he just said, "Foth," he always called me Foth. He said, "Foth, you need to do that. We need people to help and to encourage people in Washington, D.C. You need to do that." And he was always that way.
Yeah.
So he dreamed the dream with me.
Yeah. Yes. Sounds like a super affirming person in your life.
Very much so.
It's kind of staying on that dreaming piece. I think with big transitions, sometimes require a bit of reinventing ourselves.
Yes.
In terms of maybe lifestyle or the work, the ministry we do. Any advice for someone in that kind of season?
Yeah. I'll use DC again.
Okay.
Because I had been a pastor for 12 years, been a college president for 14 years. So 26 years worth of being sort of a Moses. Moses, small pond, but Moses. When we went to D.C., we became Aaron's and hers to other guys' Moses's. It wasn't our agenda, it was theirs. Our role was to come alongside and to encourage men and women in their roles as senators or admirals or generals or sergeants or commerce guys, whatever. And to help them do what they were doing, not be their staffers, but without an agenda for them, and to encourage them either deeper into Jesus or toward him. That was our function. And so in order to do that, you end up being an ambulance driver and a golfing partner and a counselor and a coffee mate and whatever, and it's their timing, not yours. That was I was used to people coming to make appointments with me for 26 years.
Yeah. And
all of a sudden, people say, "So where's your office?" I say, "In my car."
Yeah.
Because I'm going to go see Senator Hoositz or whatever.
Right. So was that adjustment hard for you?
Huge.
Or huge? Okay.
Well, it was huge in the sense that I was used to leading the charge. So I was the one with the agenda. Now it's somebody else's agenda.
Right.
Sort of the agenda of the country, if you will. The other piece of that is that you're offering to them one thing: friendship. And the higher you go in any enterprise, whether it's healthcare or the military or whatever, the higher you go, the more competitive it gets and the closer you play your cards. And you end up at the top of the heap a lot of times with 1,000 acquaintances and no friends. Leadership isn't hard because you have to make decisions. That's what leaders do.
Yeah.
Leadership's hard because you don't know who to trust.
Yeah.
So our role was to try to become a trustworthy friend to a handful of people in the most powerful city in the world. And in order to do that, one key thing that was the biggest challenge for me was that I had to be able to not act categorically, Republican, Democrat, whatever, and to suspend judgments on the front end. I was raised in a religious environment where judgments were the coin of the realm. Yeah. Where that was the currency.
Right.
And all of a sudden, if you're going to get a hearing or if you're going to get access, you cannot assume something at the front end, either by label or whatever it is. And for me, that became now sort of a lifelong learning piece. So it's been 26 years since we went there, and I'm still learning that piece.
Yeah, yeah.
I would just say this, Tim, and I'm sorry. I would say that transitions in thinking are much more challenging than transitions in place.
Yeah. Very true. Yes.
And oftentimes they go together. Very true. And I often talk about it's important to distinguish between change as a point in time, right,
or a geographical move, or
right,
some decision we make, some reaction, as opposed to transition, which is more of a process of development and growth. And oftentimes we don't take the time to really engage that piece. We just go on to the next thing. And yet you had to sink or swim in Washington, D.C. It sounds like you had to engage. It was a totally different approach to work in lifestyle, work and ministry that you were doing there.
Well, and in part, and you would, of course, understand this from Tajikistan, is that in a culture, especially in a church world culture, where oftentimes how many you speak to on a weekend, what's your audience, is the big deal. Yeah, that's not as true when you're in academic work. Right. But it's even less true if your role is to make a single friend. Just one. I asked a guy, I said, how do you get to know senators? You can't go around and leave your card because there are 15,000 lobbyists on Capitol Hill leaving their cards. Yeah. And the friend said, all you need to know is one. Just one. Invest in one. Walk with that one. And over time, perhaps you'll meet others. Yeah. But if your goal is just to be with the one, if that's your end point, that's a good place to be. Yeah. So, but for me, again, coming from the mindset of how many did you have Sunday? Right. Yeah. That's a shift.
Yeah, a big shift. Yeah. Well, this has been super enlightening for me, challenging in terms of some of the things we've talked about, especially as I think about our conversation today. That whole horizontal piece that you're talking about, which causes me, it challenges me to approach not only relationships with people in a different way, but my relationship with God. And so I don't know. We're kind of wrapping up our conversation today. Any last things you would like to say to someone, wherever they are in the world today, in a transition season, and maybe they just feel stuck or challenged by what they're facing?
I have a friend who's a conservative columnist for many years in hundreds of papers. His name was Cal Thomas. And he was fired by NBC. This is sort of how he came to faith. And when he did come to faith, he came to faith at Fourth Presbyterian Church in D.C. The pastor was a fellow named Dr. Richard Halverson. By the time I got to D.C., Richard Halverson, who had pastored there for 22 years, was the chaplain of the United States Senate. And so we used to meet some regularity. But Cal told me the story about Dick Halverson. At the end of every Sunday morning message, he would essentially give a similar or same benediction, which would be the last two verses of the book of Jude. To him who is able to keep you from falling and present you without fault and with great joy to his glorious presence, so forth. And then he would say, remember as you leave here today, wherever you are this week, whatever role, whatever place, you are not an accident. Jesus is with you. Go in his grace. So whether you're transitioning from or transitioning to, I think it's important to remember that that's not a faux pas. That's not luck of the draw. That God goes before, he comes behind, he surrounds us, he oversees us. So Richard Halverson died 3 years after I got there. I went to his memorial service. They had big screen TVs and Sunday school rooms and all kinds of things. I happened to get in the sanctuary. And the greats from D.C. came and eulogized him, including family, but people from the White House and the Senate. And then they said, let's stand for the benediction. Everybody stood, and nobody moved to the pulpit. And all of a sudden, over the PA system, Richard Halverson said, now to him who is able to keep you from falling, and to present you without fault and with great joy. And he went on and he said, remember as you leave here, you are not an accident. And wherever you are this week, Jesus is with you. And people were weeping. These are Presbyterians, right?
Yeah.
They are weeping because of this moment in time that every benediction was a blessing on the transition. Yeah. Whatever it was going to be.
Yeah. What a great encouragement to wrap up this conversation today, Dick. Thanks so much.
Thank you
for being with me. And remember, to our listeners out there, wherever you are not alone. Thanks for joining us today for this episode of Navigate Podcast.
Following this conversation with Dick, I shared with him how before I knew him as my college president, but now I know him as my friend. And that's just the way Dick is. He invites you into relationship. Such a easygoing conversational style. And I hope you gleaned something as he shared from his experience and his wisdom today. To learn more about Dick and what he does, you can hop onto his website at known.fm and learn more about what he does. What's your relational theology look like in your current transition? Are you taking time to get to know God through people? What can your relationships with people teach you about the spiritual life? As a coach, I'd love to hear your transition story. Book a discovery call with me at encompasslifecoaching.com if you're interested to learn how working with a coach can help you get unstuck and grow during this time of transition. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of Navigate Podcast. I've been your host, Tim Austin, and if this has been helpful to you, would you mind rating the podcast, writing a review, and sharing on social media? And of course, you can subscribe so that you're sure to get in on the next episode, and I'll see you there.